March 14, 1944. The wind swept gently over the plains of Hereford, Texas, carrying with it the scent of earth and sagebrush, mingled faintly with the smoke of early morning fires. The sun was just beginning to rise, a soft golden disk breaking the horizon and painting the dry grasslands in hues of amber. Roosters crowed in the distance, and the rhythmic creak of a water pump echoed near the ranch house that had long since ceased to be just a ranch. It had become something stranger, a camp surrounded by fences and watchtowers, housing men who had once fought under a flag that now meant nothing in this part of the world. Beyond those fences, hundreds of German prisoners of war stirred from sleep in long, narrow barracks. Their cots were neatly arranged, their boots aligned with almost military precision. The discipline of the Wehrmacht lingered even here, though the war they'd been fighting felt like another lifetime. Inside the main building, a woman named Mary Lou Jenkins moved briskly through the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, apron tied tight. The air inside was heavy with the warmth of stoves and the smell of flour, coffee, and grease. She had been up since before dawn, as she always was, her hair pinned back, her mind already busy with the day's work. The army had hired her as part of the civilian staff to cook for both the American guards and, on certain mornings, for the prisoner. Most days she followed the routine: beans, cornbread, potatoes, and whatever rationed meat she could find. But today was different. Today she had decided, against the suggestions of the quartermaster, to make bacon. Real bacon, thick-cut, smoked, and salted the way she remembered her mother doing it. The slabs hissed as they hit the cast-iron skillet, the fat bubbling, the sound echoing softly against the metal walls of the kitchen. For a moment she paused, watching the strips curl and brown. It was a simple, familiar sound, but in a world torn apart by war, even simple things carried weight. She thought of her husband Tom, who had shipped off to Italy with the 36th Infantry Division. Every time she cooked bacon, she remembered him sitting at their small kitchen table back home, smiling as he read the newspaper, before the war had pulled him into its machinery. In another part of the camp, a bugle call sounded, sharp, commanding, a note that sliced through the cold air. German prisoners began to line up in neat rows, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others staring out across the open fields that reminded them strangely of home. For many, Texas felt eerily like the German countryside: wide skies, endless land, the hum of insects. But there was no home here. There was only waiting, working, and trying to forget. Private Heinrich Vogel, a 26-year-old baker from Munich, pulled on his worn gray jacket and stepped outside. The dust crunched beneath his boots as he joined the others. He had been captured in Tunisia the previous year, taken prisoner after the Afrika Korps collapsed. He had survived the desert, the hunger, the long voyage across the Atlantic. Now he was here, in a place that smelled of grass and smoke instead of gunpowder and fear. He looked around at the horizon and wondered what his mother was doing at that very moment, whether she was still alive, whether his home still stood. At the far end of the camp, a few American guards leaned against a jeep, smoking. They were young, no older than the men they watched. One of them, Sergeant Bill Harper, squinted toward the mess hall. "Smells like heaven in there," he muttered, flicking ash to the ground. Another guard laughed. "Guess the cook's in a good mood today. Bacon, you think?" Back in the kitchen, Mary Lou smiled faintly as the soldiers drifted by the open door, drawn by the smell. "You boys'll get your share," she said, not looking up from her skillet. "But save some room. The prisoners are eating too." That made one of them raise an eyebrow. "The Krauts, you're feeding them bacon?" She didn't answer right away. She just flipped another strip in the pan, the edges crisping beautifully. "They're men, same as anyone. And men get hungry." When the bell rang, the prisoners moved toward the dining hall in orderly lines, escorted by guards but no longer afraid. The Americans had learned that these Germans were disciplined, polite, even hard-working. They built furniture, repaired machinery, painted barns. They followed rules. To most locals, it was still strange, the idea of German soldiers walking the fields of Texas under the same sky as them. But after months of seeing their faces, hearing them sing softly in the evenings, the fear had faded into curiosity, and sometimes even sympathy. The mess hall was simple: long wooden tables, benches, metal trays. The German prisoners sat quietly, waiting, their eyes darting toward the kitchen door. They expected the usual: a thin stew, maybe beans or rice. But then, a sound reached them, the crackle and pop of grease, and then a wave of smell so rich, so familiar, that time itself seemed to stop. Bacon, real bacon. The word itself was a memory, a feeling, a warmth. It belonged to another life. Some of the younger soldiers began whispering in disbelief. Nein, das kann nicht sein. It can't be. Others simply stared, unmoving. The first tray came out, carried by an American cook's assistant. Scrambled eggs, hot biscuits and glistening strips of bacon stacked neatly beside them. The Germans froze. They looked at each other waiting for a command, a signal that this wasn't a trick. Private Vogel's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his fork. The smell of the bacon hit him like a ghost from the past. Sunday mornings in Munich. His mother's laughter, the sound of the radio before everything changed. He took a small bite, slow, deliberate. The salt, the smoke, the warmth. His throat tightened. Around him others began to eat, and the quiet hall filled with soft sounds, forks scraping, muffled breaths. The occasional choked sob. It wasn't just food. It was memory, mercy, humanity. Some covered their faces as tears fell silently, ashamed yet unable to stop. Others smiled weakly through trembling lips. They had seen horror, burning cities, dead comrades, endless propaganda that had taught them to see the enemy as monsters, yet here they were eating breakfast cooked by a woman who didn't know their names, who owed them nothing. From the doorway, Mary Lou watched them for a while, her hands resting on her hips. She didn't understand German, but she didn't need to. She could see it in their faces, the disbelief, the grief, the longing. She felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't felt since Tom left for war. Maybe, she thought, this is what healing looked like, not grand speeches, not treaties, but a simple plate of food. Sergeant Harper stepped up beside her, still chewing on a piece of his own bacon. You'd think we gave them gold, he said quietly. Mary Lou glanced at him, her eyes soft. Maybe we did, she replied. The morning stretched on. Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher, burning away the chill. A few German prisoners lingered after breakfast, cleaning up, stacking trays, offering polite nods to the kitchen staff. One, an older man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, approached Mary Lou, pointed to the bacon and said, in halting English, "Good, very good, thank you." He placed a hand briefly over his heart and returned to his work. Later, when the kitchen was quiet again, Mary Lou sat for a moment at one of the empty tables, wiping her hands on her apron. The smell of bacon still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of soap and wood polish. She thought about the German who had thanked her. His accent had reminded her of a man she once met in town, a kind old clockmaker who had immigrated before the war. She wondered if the man she'd just fed had ever known peace before all this madness began. At that same hour, hundreds of miles away across the ocean, the war raged on. In Italy, France, Russia, men like Tom fought and bled in ruined cities, dreaming of home-cooked meals they might never taste again. But here, in this quiet corner of Texas, something unexpected had happened. A moment of humanity had broken through the war's machinery, small but undeniable. The Germans who had marched under the swastika were for one morning, simply men again, tired, hungry, and deeply painfully human. And though the guards would never admit it aloud, the sight of those enemy soldiers crying over breakfast stayed with them long after the plates were cleared. Something had changed in that hall, something invisible but lasting. Mary Lou didn't know it yet, but that morning would be remembered by the men she fed for the rest of their lives, not as a day of captivity but as the day they remembered what kindness felt like. The sun had climbed higher now, warming the tin roofs of the barracks until they shimmered faintly in the distance. A low hum of life returned to the camp as breakfast ended, boots scuffing against the dirt, the rattle of metal trays, guards calling out orders in a tone that had softened over time. The German prisoners moved in quiet rows toward their work assignments, some to the cotton fields, others to the carpentry sheds. But something in the air was different that morning. It wasn't just the lingering scent of bacon, it was the silence that followed it, the heavy, thoughtful kind of silence that comes when men begin to question everything they thought they knew. Sergeant Bill Harper stood near the gate, lighting another cigarette, his eyes following the line of prisoners as they walked by. He'd seen plenty of Germans since North Africa, some cruel, some broken, most just tired. He wasn't sure what to make of them now. They looked almost peaceful, their faces softer, their steps slower. He turned to Corporal Davis beside him and said quietly, "You see their faces? Like they saw ghosts in that breakfast." Davis nodded, exhaling smoke. Guess bacon hits different after years of war. Harper chuckled under his breath. But it wasn't humor he felt. It was something heavier, harder to name. Inside the kitchen, Mary Lou and the other cooks cleaned up in a steady rhythm. Grease still popped faintly on the skillet, as she scraped the last bits of bacon from the pan. The smell clung to her apron and hair, but she didn't mind. She had been working this job for months. Yet something about today felt deeper. She could still see their faces, those blue and gray eyes glistening under the dim mess hall light. Men trying not to cry over a breakfast plate. She wasn't sure whether to feel pity, confusion, or pride. All she knew was that for a few minutes, those men hadn't looked like enemies. The camp itself was one of dozens scattered across Texas. Hereford had been chosen because of its wide-open land and distance from the coasts, far from any potential escape routes. The prisoners worked daily, under supervision, and earned small credits they could spend at the camp store. They built fences, repaired tools, harvested crops. By all accounts, they were treated well, especially compared to the chaos still raging in Europe. Some guards even joked that the Germans ate better here than they had in the trenches, but there was a quiet rule. Kindness had limit. Too much sympathy could be seen as weakness. That rule began to blur after the bacon breakfast. Later that afternoon, while the heat shimmered across the yard, Private Vogel sat under the shade of a half-dead tree, his hat tipped low. His friend Otto Beck sat beside him, carving a piece of wood into what looked like a small bird. The air was still, except for the buzzing of flies and the occasional distant hum of a truck. Vogel turned the small tin fork in his hand and said, almost to himself, "Do you think they mean it? The Americans? Their kindness?" Otto didn't look up. "I don't know, but this morning, I felt something I haven't felt in years. It smelled like home." Vogel nodded slowly, staring into the dust. "Yes. Home." Nearby, two guards leaned on the fence, listening without understanding the words, but catching the tone. Low, reverent, honest, crazy, one whispered. "Those fellas used to be shooting at us, and now they're sitting there talking about breakfast." Harper, passing by, stopped and said quietly, "Maybe they're talking about more than breakfast." As evening fell, the camp changed moods again. The prisoners were allowed to gather in small groups after dinner, often to play music or sing. That night the faint sound of a harmonica drifted through the still air, followed by a soft baritone voice singing a German folk song, something wistful, gentle, about green fields and waiting hearts. The guards listened in silence from their posts. Even they felt it, that strange ache of homesickness that transcended uniforms. Mary Lou sat outside her small quarters, sipping coffee and watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with orange and violet, and in the distance she could see the camp lights flicker on one by one. She thought about her husband again, whether he was safe, whether he had eaten. She wondered if some woman across the sea, maybe a German like those men, was thinking the same thing about her own husband. The thought made her shiver. War was cruel, but beneath it she sensed something deeply human connecting them all. Hunger, love, memory. The next morning she returned to the kitchen before dawn. She wasn't planning anything special this time, just the usual cornbread and beans. Yet when she stepped into the mess hall, she found a small folded note left neatly on one of the tables. The handwriting was awkward, the English broken, but the message was clear. "Thank you for the breakfast. We remember." There was no name, no signature, only that line. She held the note in her hand for a long while before tucking it into her apron pocket. Word spread quickly among the staff. Some laughed about it, others shrugged. "Guess the Krauts like your cookin'," one of the younger men teased. Mary Lou smiled faintly but didn't reply. Deep down she felt something change. The line between enemy and human was thinner than anyone had told her. In the days that followed she noticed subtle differences in the camp. The German prisoners worked more diligently, their songs returned in the evenings, and the guards seemed to carry themselves with a bit less hostility. Harper noticed it too. One afternoon he caught Vogel and a few others fixing a broken fence post near the east field. "Didn't have to do that," Harper said gruffly. Vogel straightened and replied in halting English, "It was falling. We fix." Harper squinted, nodded once, and muttered, "Appreciate it." It was a small exchange, but it felt heavier than it looked. For the prisoners, the bacon had become a legend of sorts. Some called it der Morgen der Menschlichkeit, the morning of humanity. They spoke about it in low voices after lights out, recalling the scent, the warmth, the feeling of being treated like men again. A few of them began to write in journals, small scraps of paper hidden inside the lining of their clothes. "We are alive," one wrote, "and today I remembered my mother's kitchen." The American guards didn't fully understand what that breakfast had done, but they could feel its effects. The tension that once filled the camp had eased. There were fewer fights, Fewer angry words. Some guards even started bringing small gifts. A pencil, an old newspaper, a pack of chewing gum. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The officers, however, noticed too. Captain Reynolds, the camp commander, called Harper into his office one afternoon. "I've been getting reports," Reynolds said, his voice low but firm. "The men are getting too friendly. I don't mind respect, but don't forget who they are." Harper stood straight, nodding. "Yes, sir. But I don't think it's about being friendly. It's about being decent." The captain looked up from his paperwork, studying him. "Decent's fine, Sergeant. Just remember, this is war. Decency has limits." But Harper couldn't forget the sight of those men. Tears running down their faces as they ate. He'd fought in North Africa, seen comrades die in the sand, seen cruelty on both sides. Yet that breakfast had shaken something in him. Maybe decency shouldn't have limits. Maybe that was the only thing that could survive a war like this. That evening he walked to the kitchen and found Mary Lou wiping down the counters. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you started something here." She glanced up, confused. "Started what?" He smiled faintly. "A piece nobody planned." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to her work. "Well," she said softly, "maybe that's how peace always starts." Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of mesquite and soil. The fields stretched endlessly into the dark, dotted with small fires where guards and prisoners alike warmed themselves. Somewhere, an old German sang softly again, his voice thin but steady, carrying words of loss and longing that no one needed translated. For the first time since the war began, Sergeant Harper found himself listening, really listening to the sound. It wasn't an enemy's song anymore. It was a man's song, weary, human, fragile, the kind of song you could only understand once you'd seen too much. And somewhere deep inside him he realized that this war, for all its fury and madness, had not managed to destroy everything that made people human. Not yet. Weeks passed, and spring settled over the plains of Texas, softening the cold nights and bringing the faint scent of wildflowers to the dusty air around the Hereford camp. The prisoners worked in the fields, the guards walked their rounds, and the hum of normal life returned. But something in the atmosphere remained changed since that breakfast morning. It was subtle, a gentler tone in the guards' commands, a lighter step in the prisoner's gait, and an unspoken understanding that even behind barbed wire decency could still exist. For the Germans, that morning with the bacon had become a story whispered in the barracks each night, passed from one man to another like a quiet prayer. Inside the camp's carpentry shed, a small group of prisoners worked with precision, sanding planks for tables and frames. Private Heinrich Vogel ran his hand along a polished board, his fingers tracing the smooth grain. He had once made wooden bread racks in his bakery in Munich, back before the Luftwaffe took every ounce of flour for the war. He could still remember the smell of his shop, yeast, sugar, sawdust, and the laughter of his younger sister as she came to steal rolls fresh from the oven. When he closed his eyes now, he saw none of that. He saw the endless desert of Tunisia, the glare of Allied spotlights, and the long train ride that ended here. But then sometimes, just for a moment, he remembered the smell of bacon in that Texas morning and how it had made him feel like a person again. Otto Beck, his friend, was humming softly as he carved a small wooden horse. "You know what I think," Otto said without looking up. "Those Americans, they are strange. They fight like wolves, but they feed us like brothers." Heinrich smiled faintly. "Maybe they don't hate us," he said. "Maybe they just want this war to be over." Otto shrugged. "Then we are the same." Outside, Sergeant Harper leaned against a post, watching the men work. He didn't interfere much anymore. He trusted them. They had earned it. They repaired the fences themselves now, built chairs for the camp chapel, even helped paint a mural on one of the storage buildings. The mural showed a simple scene, a farmhouse, a sun and a river. The German who painted it said it was a place in the mind. Harper didn't ask for more. Later that week, a group of Red Cross inspectors arrived at the camp. They wore khaki suits, badges on their pockets, notebooks in their hands. They toured the barracks, the kitchens, the infirmary. When they reached the mess hall, one of them paused, inhaling the faint scent of grease that still clung to the air. "They seem well fed," one said. Captain Reynolds, walking beside them, nodded. "We do our best. They work hard. They eat well." The inspector smiled. "You'd be surprised how many camps we visit where that isn't true." The Germans stood straighter that day, polished their boots, and even smiled faintly at the visitors. It wasn't for show, it was gratitude. For all its restrictions, This camp had given them something they hadn't expected: dignity. That evening, Harper found himself sitting on a crate near the fence, watching the sunset. A group of prisoners gathered near the yard, tossing a worn leather ball back and forth. Their laughter drifted through the warm air. He hadn't heard that sound in years, not since before North Africa, not since before the world lost its mind. He thought about Mary Lou and her quiet defiance, about the bacon, about how one small act had rippled through this place like a stone in still water. Maybe kindness really was a kind of weapon, just one that didn't kill. Mary Lou herself had become a sort of legend among the men. They called her the Bacon Angel, though she didn't know it. A few of them had drawn small sketches of her from memory. A simple woman with an apron and kind eyes, and kept the pictures hidden in their bunks. One of them even carved her likeness into a piece of cedar wood, rough but recognizable, and placed it near his bedside as if it were a saint's image. To them she was proof that not all enemies were made of hatred. As spring turned to summer, the camp's routine became easier, almost ordinary. The prisoners planted vegetables, fixed tools, and sometimes even played soccer with the guards. It wasn't official. The captain would never approve, but on slow afternoons, when no one was watching, a few guards would kick the ball back across the fence and laugh when a German forward sprinted to meet it. The world outside was still burning, but here it was calm. One afternoon, during one of those games, the ball rolled past the fence, landing near the edge of the motor pool. A young German named Klaus jogged toward it, but instead of stopping, he hesitated, staring past the wire at the open fields beyond. The freedom was right there, endless and quiet. Harper, watching from his post, saw it too. His hand went to his rifle, instinctively, but then he stopped. Klaus bent down, picked up the ball and rolled it back. No one said a word. They just nodded at each other, two men who understood what the other could have done, and chose not to. That night, when Harper passed the kitchen, he found Mary Lou sitting alone at one of the tables. The lights dim. She was writing a letter, her pen scratching slowly against the paper. "To my dear Tom," it began. She didn't notice Harper until he cleared his throat softly. "Evening, ma'am," he said. She looked up and smiled tiredly. "Evening, Sergeant. Can't sleep either?" He shook his head and leaned against the doorframe. "Just thinking," he said. "Seems like the world's gone mad. But this place, it's different." She folded the letter carefully. "Maybe because we still remember how to be decent." He nodded. "Maybe." Over the next few months, letters from Europe began to trickle into the camp, official news about the war's progress. Normandy, Paris, the collapse of the Eastern Front. Each new update made the prisoners quieter. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of home, of survival. Vogel received a letter too, one written months earlier but only now arriving through the Red Cross. His mother was alive, his bakery destroyed. He sat on his bunk for a long time, staring at the words until the ink blurred through his tears. Otto sat beside him, saying nothing, only placing a hand on his shoulder. "At least she lives," he whispered. Vogel nodded slowly. "And she will never go hungry again," he said. "I will bake again. Someday." The next morning, the German prisoners went about their work, quieter but steadier. They sang as they built, not loudly but with purpose. The melody drifted through the camp like a memory. Even the guards stopped to listen. It wasn't a war song. It was a song of home, of rivers, of meadows, of peace. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young American soldier named Miller, new to the camp, stood near the fence watching the Germans as they worked. He had lost his brother at Anzio and carried the bitterness of that loss like a stone in his chest. When he saw the prisoners laughing together, he felt a surge of anger rise in him. "They shouldn't be smiling," he muttered. "They killed my brother." Harper, who was standing nearby, turned slowly. "They didn't," he said quietly. "Or did?" Miller glared. "That's easy for you to say." Harper met his eyes. "No, it isn't." He took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled, and looked back toward the field. "You think you hate them, but hate don't end wars, son. It just feeds the next one." Miller didn't answer. He just stared, the anger softening slightly under the weight of Harper's calm. That night, the camp was unusually still. The Germans were exhausted, the guards thoughtful. The world outside raged on, but here, kind of truce had taken hold. Invisible, fragile, but real. The next morning, the prisoners came to breakfast as usual. Mary Lou had made biscuits again, this time with syrup instead of bacon. When she served them, Vogel caught her eye and smiled. "Good," he said in his careful English. "Very good." She laughed softly. You always say that. He shrugged. Always true. After breakfast, she watched them leave, one by one through the open doorway. The light poured in, golden and warm, and for a moment she imagined her husband standing there among them, his face sunburned and tired but alive. She whispered a prayer under her breath, for him, for them, for everyone caught in this madness. The bacon breakfast had become more than a memory. It had become a symbol of what could exist even in the ugliest times. The Red Cross inspectors would later write that Hereford was one of the most humane and orderly POW camps in the United States. The guards began calling it Camp Kindness, behind the captain's back. The prisoners just called it a place where the heart remembered itself. And so the days went on, long, dusty, simple. Men worked, ate, rested. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they wept quietly at night. But there was a kind of quiet understanding now between captor and captive. They were not so different after all. Both were sons, brothers, husbands, both dreamed of peace, both longed to go home. And though no one spoke of it aloud, everyone knew that something in this small Texas camp had changed them forever. A reminder that in the middle of the world's greatest cruelty, a single act of kindness could still make men remember who they truly were. By the summer of 1945, the war was gasping its final breaths. The radio in Captain Reynolds' office crackled each morning with news from Europe. Hitler dead, Berlin fallen. The Reich surrendered. The guards listened in silence, hats in hand. Some with relief, others with unease. The war was over. But the world it had broken would take years to rebuild. In the camp, the Germans worked quietly that day, aware of the shift in tone, of the sudden absence of orders from their homeland. No more victories announced, no more speeches, just silence, and the sound of wind brushing against the Texas fences. Mary Lou was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of coffee, when one of the soldiers entered, breathless. "Ma'am," he said, "it's done. The war's over." She froze, her wooden spoon hovering over the pot. "Over," she whispered. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Europe's done. Germany surrendered." The words seemed unreal. She sat down slowly at the small table, staring at her hands, stained from flour and grease. For so long every day had revolved around that war, writing letters to Tom, reading the newspapers, cooking meals for soldiers and prisoners alike. And now it was done. But even as relief washed through her, something else crept in, the quiet, heavy thought of what came next. The news spread through the camp like a breeze. The German prisoners gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some smiled faintly. Others looked lost. For many, the war's end was both freedom and uncertainty. Home was gone, cities reduced to rubble, families scattered or dead. Sergeant Harper watched them from a distance, his jaw set. He had fought too long to celebrate easily, yet seeing the expressions on their faces, that mixture of disbelief and grief, he felt a strange kinship. The victors and the defeated were both haunted in their own ways. That night the camp was silent. No songs, no chatter. Just men sitting on their bunks, staring at the ground. Vogel sat with Otto, the letter from his mother folded neatly in his pocket. "It's over," he said softly, as if trying to convince himself. Otto nodded, carving slowly at a piece of wood. "Yes, but what is left?" Vogel didn't answer. He looked around the dim barracks, at the faces of men who had once believed themselves part of something eternal, now reduced to numbers on a roster, ghosts in a foreign land. He thought of the morning of the bacon breakfast, of that first bite that had reminded him of his mother's kitchen. That memory now felt like an anchor, something that had kept him human when everything else tried to strip that away. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Orders came down from Washington. The prisoners would be repatriated in groups, processed and sent back to Europe. The news brought mixed emotions. Some were eager to return, others fearful of what they would find waiting for them. The guards felt it too, a strange sadness, knowing the faces they'd grown used to seeing each day would soon be gone. Harper spent his mornings overseeing transport lists, his evenings walking the perimeter, remembering the first day they'd arrived, bitter, defiant, full of hate. They weren't like that anymore. Mary Lou kept cooking, her work unchanged, though her heart was heavy. She caught herself looking out toward the mess hall more often, watching the prisoners file in and out, wondering how many more meals she'd cook for them before they were gone. One morning she decided to make something special. She used what she had saved, a little extra flour, a bit of sugar, and hidden away in a tin, a few strips of bacon she'd been saving for herself. The smell once again filled the kitchen, curling through the camp like a ghost from the past. When the prisoners entered the mess hall, the moment was almost identical to that day a year earlier. The same scent, the same disbelief, the same quiet that fell over the room. They knew what it meant this time. It was a farewell. As they ate, some bowed their heads, others closed their eyes. Harper stood in the doorway beside Mary Lou, arms crossed, his voice low. "You had to do it, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "They deserve to remember home one last time." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe we all do." After breakfast, the men didn't leave right away. They stayed seated, staring at their plates, unwilling to let the moment end. Then one man stood, an older sergeant with a scar on his cheek. He raised his hand slightly and said, in slow, careful English, "Thank you." Others echoed him softly, "Danke, thank you, danke schön." Their voices blended, not loud, but full of emotion. Mary Lou pressed her hand to her chest, tears rising before she could stop them. In the days that followed, the first group of prisoners prepared to depart. They packed what little they had, handmade trinkets, sketches, carved figures, folded letters. Some left behind small gifts, a carved bird, a wooden heart, a note in broken English. Mary Lou found one of those notes tucked beneath a stack of trays in the kitchen. It read, "You reminded us that we were human." She folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket beside the old letter from her husband. On the morning of departure, the camp gathered near the gates. The trucks rumbled, engines idling. Guards checked rosters, shouting names that echoed across the dusty yard. The Germans lined up, each man carrying a small sack or bundle. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, the air still. Mary Lou stood a few paces away watching. One by one the men turned to look at her. They didn't salute as soldiers but bowed slightly as men saying goodbye to someone they respected. Vogel stepped forward, his cap in his hands. "Frau Jenkins," he said softly, his English halting. "We never forget." She smiled through her tears. "You take care now, Heinrich. You hear me?" He nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, I hear." As the trucks pulled away, a few of the men began to sing. It was the same song they'd sung on quiet nights. A gentle, melancholy tune about home and rivers and peace. The sound faded slowly into the wind until all that remained was the dust rising behind the trucks. Harper stood beside Mary Lou, his hat in his hands. "Never thought I'd miss him," he murmured. She nodded, unable to speak. The camp felt emptier after that. The barracks stood silent, the field still. A few stragglers remained for weeks, waiting for final transport. But the heart of the place was gone. The fences still stood, but they no longer held anyone. One evening, Harper walked through the empty mess hall, the smell of wood and grease still faint in the air. On one of the tables he noticed something carved into the surface, simple words in rough English: Texas, freedom, kindness. He ran his fingers over the letters, feeling the grooves like a memory burned into the wood. Months later, when Mary Lou received word that her husband had returned safely from Europe, she cried for hours. Tom came home thinner, older, his eyes shadowed by what he'd seen, but alive. He listened as she told him about the camp, about the prisoners, about the breakfast that had made grown men weep. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, "You did more good than you know." Years went by. The camp was dismantled, the barracks torn down, the land returned to the ranchers. But the memory remained. Letters began arriving from Germany, sent by men who had once been prisoners there. They wrote in careful English, their handwriting neat, their tone warm. They told her about rebuilding, about families, about how they still remembered the woman who had cooked for them with kindness. One wrote, "We had nothing, but you gave us something we did not think we would find again: dignity." In 1956, a small newspaper in Hamburg published a story titled, "The Woman Who Fried Bacon for Her Enemies." It told of the camp, of the strange kindness that had lived there, of how a simple meal had become a legend among former prisoners. Mary Lou received a copy of the article, sent by one of the men she had fed. She sat by her window that afternoon, the Texas wind stirring the curtains, and read every word slowly. When she reached the end, she smiled faintly, her eyes misting. Her granddaughter, a curious child with her same spark, asked her once, "Grandma, did you really cook for the bad men?" Mary Lou laughed softly. "They weren't bad, sweetheart. They were just men who lost their way." The girl tilted her head. "And you gave them bacon?" Mary Lou smiled wider. "Yes, bacon and a bit of kindness. Sometimes that's enough to change a heart." As the years passed, Mary Lou grew older. She still kept that small note, You reminded us that we were human. Folded neatly inside her Bible, she never spoke of it much. But those who knew her noticed that every Sunday morning when she cooked breakfast for her family, she always made bacon. She said it was for Tom, but deep down it was for those men too. For the memory of a time when humanity flickered through the darkness of war. And though the world moved on, those who had lived through that moment never forgot. Across the ocean, in rebuilt cities, in quiet German homes, men told their children about the camp in Texas where the guards treated them with respect, where a woman named Mary Lou had cooked bacon that made them remember home. For them, that memory wasn't about food, it was about mercy. Even decades later, when one of those former prisoners, now an old man, visited the United States with his family, he made a detour to Texas. He found the land where the camp once stood, no fences now, no watchtowers, just open fields, and when he stood there a long time, eyes closed, breathing in the air, and whispered "Danke," then he smiled because in that moment it smelled faintly, just faintly, of bacon.